say welcome and hello to everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here, I am excited to talk about a topic that is near and dear, certainly to my heart as the CEO. And let's see here. Maybe there I am. There am I back? There we go. As the CEO and co-founder of the International Institute for Analytics. And this is exciting because this is all we do at what we call IIA. We help large enterprises think about performance when it comes to analytics maturity and their analytics capabilities. And so anytime I have a chance to talk about what it means to measure performance, number one, and number two, keep up based on your own goals or maybe your industry goals, it's exciting. So I think we have a lot to share from an agenda perspective. I'm not going to bother with too much of my background or anything like that, but from an agenda perspective, in the time we have, I first always need to begin with why should we care about maturity or capability when it comes to data and analytics? First point, because there are still a lot of senior leaders out there who kind of maybe understand the idea of the power of data and analytics to transform their organizations, but it bears repeating because it is actually universally important these days. The second agenda item that I want to cover today is how we at IIA think about that analytics maturity score, if you will, across industries. And then related to that, I'm going to dig down a little further here and talk about what I call this association, not correlation, but association between analytics maturity and overall company performance. Share with you some what I call supporting research that corroborates a lot of the work that we at IIA have done, and then leave you with some thinking around how you can both measure your own analytics maturity, but get started toward advancing your own maturity. So I'm going to start with the end and at the beginning here, which is that to kind of share with you 5 key takeaways that I'm going to, I hope, convince you of as you spend the time today. The first is that there are a set of unavoidable macro trends that you need to be paying attention to that are driving not even the choice or opportunity, but the absolute mandate to increase your level of sophistication at your firm when it comes to analytics maturity and data maturity. I'm going to try to convey to you how quickly moving this space is as well, and almost draw this, I'll call it the minimum bar, the minimum threshold of what I would call analytics capabilities, the table stakes now that firms need to continue to compete. I mentioned earlier this positive association, this positive correlation that we see between analytics maturity and company performance. I want to show you the actual math behind that. As I mentioned, there is a growing body of academic and market research that you can use to actually support with senior leadership and some of the skeptics this link between analytics maturity, analytics capability, and company performance. So we have a lot of unassailable data and research, but there is a broader group of academic and market research that I think you want to keep in mind. And lastly, I am setting a mandate that you must, as an enterprise, both understand and measure your analytics maturity over time. Whatever you strive to do in life, whether it be at your work or in a personal life, measuring honestly and objectively where you stand in that endeavor is critical. Whether it's learning a new sport or learning a new hobby, at some point, you need an objective assessment of where you stand, both relative to your own goals, but also relative to your peer group. And so those are the big 5 takeaways. So let me start quickly here with my first agenda item, which is, why does this matter? And I'm going to, again, walk you through sort of key takeaway number one, which is that to talk a little bit about what I'll call the macro landscape. Now, you aren't meant on this slide, obviously, to pick out individual brands, but this is courtesy of our friend Matt Turk. It's about a 2-year-old slide, but as you look carefully here, the sophistication and complexity of the technology, data, and say AI landscape as of 2019, the complexity is exploding, and different technology providers are proliferating in just about every technology domain on the left side, and as you can see, also industry-specific applications on the right side. So this is a world that is increasingly complex and difficult to sort of pay attention to, but the technologies are racing ahead. The size of the investments that are being made in what we might broadly call the big data marketplace, for shorthand, continues to grow and shows kind of no abatement. So here we are in 2021, $64 billion, and by 2027, we're talking over $100 billion of market size. So this is evidence that that industry is investing heavily in this new data and analytics marketplace. The other big trend that we keep track of and that many folks are talking about is then the rise of cloud computing. And in the world that we live in at IIA, the analytics, the data and analytics component, how the data and analytics market is being impacted by this is significant. So this is data through the fourth quarter of 2019. So it's about 2 years old, but I think it proves a point here, which is this is just simply showing you the both operating income and top line revenue of a division of Amazon called Amazon Web Services. I'm sure many of you are familiar with AWS or Amazon Web Services. This is an increase. AWS owns about a third, give or take, of the cloud computing market. And just simply seeing how quickly this business is growing shows you that customers are largely moving to the cloud for many things, including their data and analytics capability, right? So if this is not something that you're doing inside of your enterprises, others are, and I would argue that that's something that you might want to keep track of. And the real payoff picture, I know we have a lot of healthcare clients, healthcare companies on the phone today, but the real payoff, the real result of all of these macro forces is massive, what I call company and industry disruption. So specifically, let's just again take 2020 data here. These are new entrants in the healthcare space in the upper left, but if you're in another industry, find your industry across this grid, courtesy of our friends at CB Insights. These are just a set of data and analytics disruptors, companies that are coming in and actually disrupting traditional large enterprises in these spaces. On the right side here is a set of examples I've labeled. I've just highlighted a few that I think are important in biopharma, healthcare, the sort of that world. So you can see DNA data marketplace. This is something that I'm particularly interested in, that concept that you would have a data marketplace in the world of DNA. The point here is, on the right side, 36 unique startups that could change the world. If you are sitting in a relatively large enterprise today, these small players are eating your lunch or are trying to eat you around the edges, if you will, and claim parts of your market. And so back to the central point here, there is this tension now between disruptors and those that are being disrupted. And so our first sort of main point is pay attention to what's going on in the macro environment today, because it can be, it certainly can be, there is disruption happening here. So I'm seeing nice questions come in in the Q&A area here as well as in the chat. So keep those coming, and I am going to answer those, both of those questions that have come in so far I'm going to get to. So, but keep those coming as we go forward here. So another element here that I think proves this sort of market level disruption point is the average lifespan of a company in the Standard & Poor's 500 index, the S&P 500. So first big headline is that in the last 15, 16 years, over half of S&P companies have actually disappeared. Well, we would argue that they have been marginalized, they have been disrupted out of business. That's sort of the first point. The second point is that a companion point is that the lifespan of companies has gone from way back in the early 50s, late 50s and 60s to 60 plus years to now 15, 16, 17 years. As the economy changes, as new technologies outstrip old technologies and new business models tend to disrupt existing companies. This is evidence to us, at least, that within the world we work in, this data and analytics world, things are happening that you all, that if you're leading a company or you're working at a company, you should be paying attention to. So that's sort of big takeaway, big data and evidence here, I think, for big thought number one, which is keep track of those macro trends because everything is changing and you want to make sure that you're ahead of disruption, not behind disruption, I guess is what the best way to say it here. So lots of good questions coming in already. How do we create a data-driven culture? How do we verify that data are okay? So we'll get to all that. So I'm starting at the macro level. Let me sort of double click down now to what I'll call the industry level. And this is, I'm going to be sharing then some proprietary data that we at IIA capture. And before I get to talking about industry, how different industries are faring with respect to analytics maturity, I'm going to share two simple but critical, what I call frameworks around how we think about measuring analytics maturity. The first is called the 5 stages of analytics, or the 5 stages of analytics maturity. And this is fairly straightforward. Stage 1 on the left, moving up to stage 5 on the right. This first framework, which is the 5 stages, is sort of how we think about scoring and counting, was first offered in a book called Competing on Analytics. My co-founder, Tom Davenport, authored that book, and then we've recently updated it in a newer version of Competing on Analytics, which I'll share some of those updates here in a second. But if you took nothing away from today, then a helpful framework from analytical beginner all the way up to analytical competitor. Let me talk quickly about each of these stages here. An analytical beginning company is literally where there is no thinking, there is no intention around using data to make better decisions. There have been sort of no initiatives, there isn't any coordination, there really isn't any intention. And unfortunately, that is the case in many organizations today. As we move up to what we call localized analytics into analytical aspirations, that is stages 2 and 3, this is kind of what I would argue is kind of the fat of the bell curve today. So you have localized analytics where analytics is largely happening in pockets, number one, and it's fairly remedial. We might even call it business intelligence or reporting as opposed to anything advanced. So it's number one, siloed, and it's number 2, simple. And by the time you move up into stage 3, you generally are seeing some sort of recognition, some sort of intentionality, if you will, among leadership that, hey, this is something we should actually pay attention to. This is something we should pay attention to the same way we do the other ways that we compete in our marketplaces, whether, as a retailer where we put stores, as a healthcare provider where we, how we deliver care. So there's some intentionality by the time you get to stage 3. And then things get very interesting here, and that's the nature of this logarithmic arrow that you see, where the stages 4 and 5 are what we call an analytical company, and then an organization that is a true analytical competitor. And I'll share with you some data, in terms of what we call the digital natives that sit up in that analytical competitor category. But the analytical company has basically taken on the idea of using data and analytics to compete as part of their whole strategy. So you really see it, you see it not only present, but you see it, folks, their actual financial outcomes inside of their companies are actually often determined by the extent to which they use data and analytics. So for the sake of today, stage 1 to 5, think of that as kind of our scoring ruler. It's our rubric for how we score maturity. And then I'm going to share something we call the Delta Plus model, again, very quickly here, that started in Tom Davenport's second book, Analytics at Work, when it was introduced, when it was just the Delta model. And so think of this, instead of the way we score things, think of this as what we're scoring. And so in very quick fashion here, we see a total of what we call 7 big areas that are important to measure and to think about. You can see them here on the slide: data, enterprise, leadership, targets, and analysts. And then we're going to add in, most recently, analytics, techniques, and technology here. So very quickly, from the perspective of each of these, data really speaks to the quality, the depth, the breadth, the accessibility of your firm's data assets, which is really at the core of what we're doing, in the sense, in terms of analytical answers and analytical thinking. The E of Delta stands for enterprise, and that's the extent to which the firm thinks of managing analytics across the enterprise, not in silos. So if you come back to the scoring methodology that I described earlier, the idea that you're managing analytics in silos and those silos aren't communicating or comparing notes is a sign of immaturity. So the extent to which an enterprise uses and manages analytics across the enterprise is important to think about. Leadership stands for, the L of Delta stands for leadership, and that is the extent to which senior leaders are walking the talk. What passion and commitment do they have to this? Targets the T of Delta stands for targets. And this is essentially the extent to which a firm actually is articulating well and actually aiming this capability at the best business opportunities that exist. So the extent to which that we're actually solving the most pressing business problems or target areas. And then finally, the people component is the A of Delta, and that stands for analysts. And that can be both the professional analysts, how good and sophisticated are the folks that are actually provisioning analytics, but it also refers to what we call the demand side, the consumers of analytics. How good are they in terms of consuming analytics to make better decisions? Analytics, techniques, and technology, I think, are fairly straightforward here. The technology one is easier. We separated the actual quality of data from the housing, if you will, the apparatus that houses that data, and that's how we came up with technology. And then techniques increasingly is a companion to analysts, and it's the extent to which the firm is actually using what are more sophisticated quantitative methods against the data assets that they own. So taken together, I know it's a lot to consume here, but these 7 letters taken together form what I call the Delta Plus model. So 5 stages of analytics maturity and the Delta Plus model. So to get to what I think is interesting for everyone, across the horizontal axis here, you have that 1 to 5 scoring model that I described, the 5 stages of maturity. And in all of the work that we have done at IIA, for the most part, we're seeing this kind of bell curve that has this very long tail on the right side, where there are fewer and fewer, there aren't that many who are really great at this. And from our own data, so what the bell curve you see is kind of our estimate of the world. It's what we think, it's our supposition. Then our actual data that we collect in 2 ways, through our assessment cohort as well as our market leader cohort, tends to support this a bit, particularly that assessment cohort that, largely folks are in the high 1s, low 2s with a long tail on the right. So this is across our entire population. Now, the part that we think is most interesting here is the work we've been doing in benchmarking what we call market leader companies. These are companies that are recognizable brands, they're leaders in their particular industries, and asking a simple question, which is there an association? Where do these companies rank with respect to their analytics maturity relative to their peer group? So if you're in an industry that there are 12 large industries and a bunch of segments that we track here, this gives you a sense for how we think about the industries. I mentioned digital natives. Let's hold those aside for a second, but you see pretty traditional industries here, from financial services and retail and manufacturing to both healthcare provider and payer organizations, but so the insurance side, transportation, consumer, and then we do look at oil and gas, we look at media and entertainment and other industries. So this kind of gives you a sense for the industries that we study. And I guess if you were to take a picture of my screen to take back with you, the next two slides are the ones that I think you should take a picture of. So if I were to ask you all, where do you think, where would you say the strongest industries are today? I think you'd all probably say, well, probably the Netflixes and the Amazons and the LinkedIns of the world, what we might call the digital native segment, they probably would be at the top, and you'd be right there. But then if you then lay out all of those industries, what's really, I think, interesting is to see the different color bands here, the clusters in terms of maturity level. So on the vertical axis, all those industries that we track, and then across the horizontal, what you see is the median score for those industries. And so unfortunately, for the healthcare space, the news is not so great in terms of your competitiveness relative to other industries. And so I think there's a story that comes through along the vertical axis here with respect to disruption. I'll come back to that point. At the top end, you have industries, financial services, consumer brands, retail, pharma, medical devices, who have been at this for a long time. They're data rich based on their business. In the pharma and medical device space and biopharma, they're obviously doing a lot of R&D work. So these tend to be data-rich industries who've been around for a long time, and their maturity is fairly high. Then if you kind of go into the middle area, starting with CPG, traveling all the way down to utilities and telecom, less mature, right? Less mature, but still an element of understanding and intentionality and sort of middle scores. And then the bottom cluster, which is largely in insurance, healthcare providers, you can see QSR and so on, but the opportunity is great there, but the scores are lower. And I think the conclusion here is that the disruptors, if they're looking at our slide, they're probably eyeing the bottom rows, and they're saying, what could we, if we're Amazon, do that potentially could disrupt some of those laggard industries? One anecdotal piece of evidence was when Amazon bought Whole Foods in the grocery space. They really revolutionized that group. They came in as kind of an outsider, and I think really put that supermarket and food retailing on notice, that said, hey, we're interested in this space. You have seen Jeff Bezos talk publicly also about the inefficiencies in healthcare and disruption there. So again, take a picture of this slide. This is probably the most interesting one that we at IIA provide. So really, it's the same data I showed you on the prior slide, but what you see here then are the top and the bottom bands by industry in terms of maturity. And so you see a bit more clustering, that is tighter bands on the right side, and you see much wider bands between the top performers and the lower performers on the left slide here. Right. And so particularly in healthcare insurance and in the healthcare provider space, you see some real winners up in the high 3s, low 4s, but you also see that the bottom end of this in terms of maturity scores. So this is all available on our website if you have an interest in seeing some of this industry related data. So in the spirit of time, I'm going to keep moving here because I'm pretty sure we have, I want to allow some time for questions. So to the question then that's next on my agenda is, if we've talked a little bit about the macro forces, we've talked about what I call industry league charts, or thinking about maturity by industry. Now, the question that we seem to get from leadership all the time is, okay, is this investment really going to make a difference in my overall company performance? Can you prove to me that this is as important as other things that I do in terms of how I compete in my marketplace, how I set my prices, where I put my locations, my products, my service features, that kind of thing? And the answer that we're bringing forward is there is a great deal of company performance that can be had, increased positive company performance across a number of metrics that can be had for a relatively small investment in cleaning up data and being able to run analytical insights on this. So I'm going to go through this very quickly as we looked across 123 market leader companies. You can get a sense for the industry distribution relative to the S&P 500. You can get a sense for the number of companies in each of these categories. I'm going to just keep moving here. This is what we have found to be the most important. If you simply take two important company growth metrics, 3 and 5 year revenue growth and operating income growth for 5 and 10 years. Okay, and you then cross that with our analytics maturity scores, stages 2, 3, and 4. What's dramatic here is the difference in financial performance between stages 2, 3, and 4, right? In these 5 top line and bottom line revenue and operating income figures that we see here. What's also, I think, interesting is that you get this distance, this delta, the difference between a stage 3 and a stage 4, if you compare it versus a stage 2 and a stage 3. I'm going to leave you with some ideas about how to get started and how to move into a stage 3 and how to move into a stage 4. But this idea of logarithmic, that you put your investment in stage 2, make some incremental improvements into stage 3, but look at the growth rate, look at the difference between the purple and the blue in terms of stage 4 and stage 3 here. So really, really important. In terms of other financial metrics here, we have investment return. Just again, I won't go into too much detail here. Again, the picture is pretty similar. The picture kind of, you get the same concept here. And then, the last thing I think I want to share with you in terms of this association between investment and analytics and company performance is it's not all just about financial metrics. We also found an interesting correlation here between companies that were on lists that were like most admired companies, best places to work, most innovative companies, that kind of thing. Look at the difference in the numbers in terms of the figures for those companies that were on the list. This is their analytics, their average analytics performance, and those that were not on the list. Right? It's interesting. I think increasingly companies are admired for, and will be in the future admired for, their data and analytics capabilities. So it's not just about the financial figures. It's also about other metrics that I would argue you should probably think about. So in the end, I showed you just a collection of the operating and financial metrics that we crossed with and compared in terms of analytics maturity. We actually did this across a whole series, 68 operating and financial metrics. So we just wanted to be sure that we were trying to create, again, an association. I'm going to stop and not use the word correlation, but 57 of those 68 performance metrics actually showed a positive association when it came to analytics maturity. Again, I'm not going to say correlation because there are many things that drive company performance, but certainly we would argue there is a positive association, or at least a neutral association in 11, but pretty positive association between all of these. Okay, I'm going to quickly check Q&A here one more time. Okay, good. Let's see here. Okay. Great. So I see some good questions that I'm going to hold and try to be done right in another call it 13 or 14 minutes here. We work with a lot of accounts who say this is all great. We believe in the data that you've collected, but is there other supporting research and other supporting academic evidence, supporting research that kind of supports this idea of the idea that analytics and company performance are correlated? This is, again, all available on our website, or happy to send it along to anybody that has an interest here. But all the way back in 2007, when the first version of Competing on Analytics came through, all the way through 2020, 19, 2020, 2021, there are numerous studies that are out there that approach this question from a variety of different angles here. Initially, when Tom Davenport and Jeannie Harris wrote the first version of Competing on Analytics, and then they updated it in 2017, zero in here, high performers in terms of profit, shareholder return, and revenue growth, 50% more likely to use analytics strategically, and 5 times as likely to as low performers, right? So they've used the word significant correlation between higher levels of maturity and robust 5-year compound annual growth rate revenue rates. So they sort of lit the fuse here. Great article in Harvard Business Review, again, that Tom Davenport co-authored here. You can read this, but the top 1/3 were 5% more productive and 6% more profitable in some work that Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson did at MIT back in 2012. Capgemini, you'd expect the consulting firms to be in on this as well. But here again, their study shows that those that demonstrated the highest level of, they called it digital maturity, and obviously analytics and data, a critical part of that, demonstrated higher revenue, profitability, and higher market value. So 9%, 26%, and 12% respectively across those three. The folks at McKinsey obviously have gotten in on this as well, and they tend to be specific by industry. So on the left-hand side, you see things like, data and analytics capability correlating with assortment optimization and upselling and churn and pricing acumen, correlating over to really important gains on the bottom line. One other study here, again, increase in productivity about just over 4%. So good, British Journal of Management, all the management journals getting in on this. And so to summarize, I guess the other piece is the number of papers that we're seeing, the number of folks that are actually studying this correlation continues to rise. So you see the role of primary papers and secondary papers. So again, this is available if anybody would like it, but the sort of summary note here, if you were to hand to management, again, take a picture of this image. If there's anybody in your leadership ranks who doubts this, here is the Cliff Note version of the most compelling research, in addition to the data that IIA has collected, sort of show that, hey, this actually is a pretty interesting area to make investment in, and we can get some pretty good gains compared to other things that we invest in. We've quantified all of our data in this research brief. Again, it's available if anybody is interested. So I think what I've tried to do here in the short time is to try to build a case that that at the industry level, there's a lot of disruption happening and you need to pay attention to it. There is a very strong correlation between investment in data and analytics and overall company performance. And I want to finish sort of with, the common question. These are the same key takeaways that I shared with you earlier. And the question that we often get is, okay, I buy it, I get it. How do I get started? What's my best approach. I'm going to skip through some of this here, and I'm going to just share with you, okay, when a firm who is sitting at stage 2 says, okay, what do I need to have in place here so that I can get to stage 3? This is really the checklist. This is the grocery shopping list. These are the kinds of characteristics that need to be in place. You have to have high-level executive support that sits outside the analytics organization. In other words, senior leaders have to walk the talk. You have to differentiate between, what we often call just basic reporting, dashboards, and something that is more advanced than that. Often enterprises, when they get to stage 3, they say, oh, we understand the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? You have to have, at number 3 here, you have to have some really strong element of a data governance program. It's sort of like, your fields have to be well organized, your crops have to be well organized if you're going to actually harvest them. That's sort of the metaphor that comes that comes to mind. On the demand side, has to be a consistency in how analytics is consumed by the business stakeholder side. So this gets to the question that came earlier about how do I drive a data-driven culture? Well, there's a lot of messaging, there's a lot of training that needs to go to make the business side good consumers. You also have to have that same kind of consistency in how analytics are provisioned and developed and deployed across the enterprise. And generally speaking, those that are advancing to stage 3 are moving at or faster than the pace of the overall market. Back to my top level sort of market thinking. If you then go into the magic stage 4, you start to see even more advanced techniques here. Data mastery, flexible dynamic IT architecture. So clearly the cloud is here. You start to see innovation oriented culture. So you get real product thinking, real innovation around what could we do with the data that would actually, transform our business. So this is sort of the real high end, the most advanced folks who are really saying, okay, this is our area to really innovate and expand our company. So with that, I've seen a couple of good questions come in, and let me see if I think I've answered a few of them. The one that seems to pop in here a couple of times here is this idea of a data-driven culture. How do you recommend we create one? Well, okay, it doesn't happen overnight, for sure. And I think it really requires an analytics leader. It could be a chief analytics officer, chief data officer, but someone to spearhead that. It's hard to change a culture without having some sort of lightning rod, some sort of person who is leading that effort. And there are a number of techniques that we recommend. But certainly, I think number one, you have to have some sort of a single analytics leader there that's actually leading that charge. Let's see. A couple other good questions here in terms of healthcare specific, and yeah. So okay. So in terms of time here, we're probably, broadly speaking, there are a set of KPIs, there are a set of metrics or measurement points that we would recommend that are specific to healthcare. But in the end, I would still come back to the Delta Plus model at the top end and see if those KPIs match to data, enterprise, leadership targets, analysts, and so on, that we spoke about earlier here. So probably beyond the scope and the time to get too specific on healthcare, but how do they match to those broader ones? Few other questions here. How are we doing on time?
We have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So I do see one question here, Jack, from John. It says, how do you verify data analytics to be accurate?
Okay, John, good question. And I think largely that is going to come back to the D of the Delta model, D, and then the extra T that we've added, D for data and T for technology. So accuracy drives trustworthiness. Trustworthiness drives, the ability to actually consume and make change. So verifying that your data is accurate is something that is specific to the enterprise, right? But ultimately, when we find the ultimate sort of arbiter of that question, the business stakeholder partner, when they are in alignment in terms of trustworthiness, then I think you can believe it's accurate enough. Tom Davenport is famous for saying, if you spend all your time perfecting the data, you will never get to the good stuff, which is, what does the data mean? So there is a limit to how high quality and how accurate you want to make your data. I'm not saying use inaccurate data. I'm saying that if you isolate portions of data and inspect its veracity and its accuracy, that's a good approach rather than trying to boil the entire ocean here. Let's see, Todd, a good question here. It's surprising that healthcare is on the lowest end, especially with all the regulatory and data privacy requirements. Is this an enabler or a detractor? I think a good question. Certainly regulatory will be an enabler for sure. I would argue that as we think about overall analytics maturity, the data privacy piece actually ends up inhibiting progress toward answers, right? And so I know that sounds very counterintuitive, because in the healthcare space, privacy, HIPAA is paramount. If you take a peer over in the retail space, they think of customers and they don't think as much about privacy, although they are being forced to do that. But largely, I think what we're seeing is, just to be honest, kind of a lack of a real imagination, and particularly in the provider space, when it comes to how can we obviously respect privacy, but do interesting things that can reduce, ER waiting times, that can improve quality of care, those kinds of things. I don't think we see as much imagination in the healthcare provider space as we do, say, in retail, financial services, some of those industries that were further up. Okay, let me look here.
So Jack, here's another question.
Sure.
If someone already has an assessment framework, how would they use that to estimate their maturity?
Yeah, great question. So we have shown, I've provided 2 frameworks that we believe are industry standard and are the right frameworks to use. But commonly we'll get requests from an enterprise that says, hey, we already use the ABC approach and the 1, 2, 3 scoring method. If you're interested, if you want to self-assess, that's quite good. I think most enterprises, we see it as a sign of maturity, are adopting something that is, number one, external and objective. It doesn't change, right? Number one. And number two, it's sort of simple to understand, but thorough enough. And so, yeah, this might sound self-serving here, but we would argue that adopting something from the outside means that you're not going to get any kind of question about, wait, are we kind of just, breathing in our own smoke, that concept? No, we actually used an objective, an external framework. So I think you at some point will cross a threshold where you self-assess, and then you'll say, wait a second, we should probably match what the rest of the industry is doing, and find the right one that's external.
So on that note, this is the last session of the day, so let's add a couple minutes here. I mean, you just mentioned the rest of the industry. How do you rate yourself compared to your nearest competitors?
Yeah, well, so I would argue you might kind of, the answer could be the same. So you can use your own internally gathered intelligence. You've got market research teams, probably you've got intelligence teams inside of your 4 walls as enterprises, and you could try to estimate, where are we relative to our peer group. Again, I think IIA is really the world leader with respect to providing that intelligence. So who is the right peer set to compare against? Number one, and I'm sure that most of the competitors you would think of in healthcare or construction or retail are there, but there might be some other comparables or competitors that you'd want to compare yourself against. And so, I think increasingly there are, I don't want to sound like IA is the only source for this, but ultimately there are a lot of data sets out there that can help you do this, on the outside. So, and do it at a level of detail that is not just, at the general level, but actually enough detail where you could say, okay, we're behind in data, but we're kind of at the market with respect to, I don't know, I'll make it up, leadership. So maybe we should focus on data. So getting more prescriptive in terms of what do we do next? That's what an outside party can probably provide.
Fantastic. I mean, this is a subject that I think is becoming more and more relevant and prevalent.